Welcome to an introduction to economics, brought to you by Parkbench Tutors and narrated by David Hopcroft. For further information about Parkbench Tutors, please visit parkbenchtutors.com. This short podcast continues our discussion about resource allocation. In our first podcast on resource allocation, we considered the market economy that relied on the price mechanism, and the command economy with central planning. In this podcast, we shall consider the merits and weaknesses of each of these. First, we shall look at the price mechanism. Under perfect conditions, the price mechanism should be efficient, meeting consumer choice more accurately than a central planning group. Economic efficiency would also mean that nobody could be made better off without somebody else becoming worse off. Since the market is unregulated, the consumer demand should determine the preferred output of goods and services. Firms are competitive, and that should also help give a freedom of choice to the consumer. A centrally planned economy would have a smaller choice of goods and services. Events can change quickly in a world market, affecting the supply of goods and the supply of raw materials. A market economy will be able to respond quickly to this, since it has not been set targets by a central body. With competition, there is an incentive to change rapidly. Firms were able to respond quickly to the technology advances in the 1980s. The change in oil prices in the 1970s helped produce more efficient use of fuels, with the market economy able to respond quickly. Without state intervention, it is argued that firms will be more willing to undertake risk ventures. Where there is more competition, there is an incentive to take more risks. These risks will include investing to embrace technological changes. The expected result should be higher economic growth. Whilst there are advantages to the price mechanism, it is not perfect, and we should now look at some of the disadvantages. Perhaps the most obvious comment here is that the price mechanism does not give choice that is completely fair or equal. Since the market responds to demand, those with the greatest purchasing power will create a demand for higher priced goods. This is the idea that consumers have in fact money votes, and that the rich will have more votes than the poor. At its worst, this might mean resources diverted to producing luxury goods, and the poor having insufficient goods that are needed. Examination of unemployment over the last 50 years shows that the price mechanism has operated and has produced several periods of high unemployment and recession. This means that production and consumption have got out of line. If there is a surplus of unsold goods, then production will be cut and workers will be laid off. If an industry fails in one area and new industry is established in other areas, then workers may not be willing to move. Sometimes they may not be able to. This results in what we call structural unemployment. In the 1970s, with the oil crisis, there was severe inflation, and in the 1980s, inflation again rose quickly. It has been noted that the price mechanism does seem prone to periods of high inflation. Although we argued that the consumer determines demand by choice, we have to accept that in today's economy there is a massive amount of advertising carried out to persuade the consumer to make certain choices. We can describe this as a contrived demand. The market, as we have already noted, is not perfect. Information about goods and services is not freely available. There is government intervention for some goods and services, and there are monopolies where price is not determined by the price mechanism. With a central planning mechanism, there should be less waste of resources. All resources should be fully employed. Given that there is control of prices, then the level of inflation should be much lower, though it will still be influenced by scarcity of resources. The appeal of a command economy to many was the concept that it would reduce the gap between rich and poor. It would minimize the equality of wealth and income that was clearly present, and believed to be inevitable in the price mechanism. If there were a need to change direction, then it should be easy to switch resources from producing one good to producing a different good. It sounds very nice in theory, but in practice there have been a number of problems. So what are the disadvantages? In order to plan centrally, there is a need to gather information. This can be expensive and a labour-intensive process. The price mechanism, it could be argued, through its casting of money votes, does all this for free. How can we estimate demand? If there are no guidance indicators from changes in demand, which are a part of the market economy and the price mechanism, then how is demand to be determined? Given that the whole process of production is planned ahead, then there is going to be a time lag between the gathering of information and the implementing of plans for production. These gaps have been seen to be significant. Often a central planning mechanism will try and plan for several years ahead, and this makes it more difficult to change plans for production. Perhaps the two biggest criticisms have been that a command economy lacks incentives for workers and managers, and that it restricts choice for the consumer. In theory, in a command economy, everyone is an owner. In practice, nobody really felt as if they owned anything. This removed the incentive to do well, to make the extra effort, to be innovative, and to push forward for economic growth. More attention now is given to the economies of less developed countries, particularly where the governments have taken a stance that is seen as trying to mix ideas from a command economy with those of a market economy. Long-term plans have often been attempted, but these have ignored problems over foreign exchange and the effect of natural disasters. A particular problem for some of these countries has been the difficulty in raising capital for investment. Foreign firms will only be willing to invest if there are considerable advantages for them. Overseas governments usually have restrictive terms on foreign aid. Next, in this podcast, we shall take our first look at open economies and how resources are allocated. When we considered closed economies, we were considering a largely hypothetical situation where only goods produced within that community were being consumed by the community. A quick look around your home will tell you that this is simply not the case. At this moment I am sitting in a room where the furniture came from at least 3 different countries, and the computer was made in a 4th country, and if I turn the gas fire on, then I'm using an energy source from a 5th country. We live then in a world that is increasingly an open economy, with trade between countries as the normal situation. Of course, we can argue that this has always been so. Wool trading across Europe has been going on since the 14th century. How does trade between 2 countries benefit both countries? Clearly, in some cases trade is needed because a resource does not occur in a country, or where it is difficult to produce an item in a country. We cannot grow tropical fruits easily if we live in northern Canada. An important theory was put forward by the economist Ricardo, who stated that as long as relative production costs in 2 countries, A and B, differ, then exchange can potentially give benefits to both countries. We're going to look at an example of this. We consider 2 countries, A and B, producing food and cloth through efficient use of resources. Both produce equal amounts of cloth, but B is capable of producing more food than A. We are assuming that there are constant opportunity costs and that there is full employment. The production possibility frontiers are shown for each country by the red lines. The key to this is to understand opportunity costs. In terms of food, the opportunity cost to produce an extra ton of food for A is 1 metre of cloth. What about B, where 200 tons of food are produced, or 100 metres of cloth? The opportunity cost for producing an extra ton of food is only 0.5 metres of cloth. So B has a comparative advantage in food production. Now I can use this argument in the other direction. Country A only gives up 1 ton of food to produce each extra metre of cloth, but country B has to give up 2 tons of food to produce each extra metre of cloth. So now A has a comparative advantage in cloth production. We can see that both countries now have something to gain. Here is the position before trade between the 2 countries. Country A will produce 50 metres of food and 50 metres of cloth. Country B will produce 100 tons of food and 50 metres of cloth. We've taken the midpoints here, assuming this was the desired output for the two countries. The total production would then be 150 tonnes of food and 100 metres of cloth. We said that each country had a comparative advantage, so A might specialise and produce 100 metres of cloth, and B produce 200 tonnes of food. Now, the immediate clue here is to note that total production from the two countries has now risen. So let us say that the two countries come to an agreement about the exchange of food for cloth. Country A is going to export 50 metres of cloth in return for 75 tonnes of food. Now look at the totals and compare these with what happened before specialisation. Each country still has its 50 metres of cloth, but both countries now have more food. The exchange has benefited both countries. The way in which countries trade in an open economy sometimes follows what Vernon called a product cycle model. You will study more about this later. Initially, a country may develop a labour-saving device, the demand being from new technology. It will be sold in this country, and then some may be exported to another country. What if the cost advantage shifts, so that the product can now be produced in another country? Well, production will shift as well. The result might even be that the product is then exported back to the country that first started producing it. A technology boom in the 1980s occurred in the United States, with production of computers and associated equipment like printers. You might want to think about how most computers have now come to be produced in other countries and are shipped back to the United States. This ends our second podcast on resource allocation, brought to you by Parkbench Tutors and narrated by David Hopcroft. Thank you for watching and for listening. We wish you every success in your studies. For further information about Parkbench Tutors, please visit parkbenchtutors.com.